when alt stops meaning alternative, because reasons. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and the comments on my last videos about disowning the label of alt-left got me thinking about this concept of framing, and the success that mainstream media has in changing a narrative simply by basically dishonestly framing a topic they are talking about. Dishonesties based around framing are very often a political tool used in media and campaigns, which are kind of hard to grasp if you haven't thought hard about them. There was a book that you can read called Don't Think of an Elephant, which was written last decade that has a very left-leaning spin, as I remember, but it gets at the concept a lot. The way you frame a statement, campaign ad, or entire news story can shape majorly crucial things about the viewer's perception within seconds that can almost be impossible to change after the fact. Once you frame something a certain way, you can rarely change people's minds about it. The way you frame a topic acts like a first impression, and first impressions are known to be very difficult to shake off. The obvious example that people tend to use about this is if somebody asks somebody in an interview, "Are you still attending AA meetings?" Implying, obviously, that the person being asked said question is an alcoholic who at some point had to get treatment for alcoholism. This could be entirely untrue, of course, and at which point the person has to decide whether to entertain the notion that they might be an alcoholic, deny that they might be an alcoholic, which often will be followed with the statement of, "That's what alcoholics always say," or they can just freak out and get all mad, none of which is a particularly desirable outcome for the person who had the dishonestly framed, loaded question asked upon them. That said, framing mechanisms aren't just confined to loaded questions by a long shot. They can be inserted into campaign advertisements, news programs, and basically everywhere else that you can imagine. And that seems to be what media has done with the term alt in reference to politics, both to the alt-right as well as the alt-left. Currently, many people argue that the alt-right was coined by Richard Spencer, especially Spencer himself, and that, therefore, it is an official white nationalist label. And I can't say I personally tracked its origins because I was a lifelong lefty who never deeply explored the right wing up until late 2015. However, when I did begin exploring the right, I found all sorts of people referred to as alt-right, and groups full of people that would be called that, or even who identified that way personally. Basically, the label alt-right just referred to people who were internet savvy, usually non-traditionalist, right-wing economically in the way that they were libertarians for the most part, and they hated legacy Republicans like the Bushes and McCains of the world. That's what I knew as alt-right at the time. However, one thing I noticed for sure prior to late 2016 was that the vast majority of people in these groups on Facebook that I found that could be called alt-right were actually pretty non-bigoted at their core and really cared a lot more about ideas than people's identities, which was one of the main reasons they dislike the identity politics obsessed left. However, all of that changed when Hillary Clinton gave her speech about the alt-right, and then even more so when Hillary Clinton lost the election, and places like the Southern Poverty Law Center almost immediately published an expose claiming that everybody even vaguely associated with the label alt-right was a white supremacist due to Richard Spencer, which eventually was one of the main causes of Antifa violence. That was an act of malicious framing by leftist media and organizations like the SPCA, which we can assume had the motivation of discrediting Trump's victory, doubling down on their relentless accusations that Trump supporters were racist, Islamophobe misogynists, and trying to further polarize our nation into easily packaged categories. The establishment was certainly threatened by the idea that there were right-wing voters who mostly didn't give a fuck what skin color or gender people were, or even that they might be gay, just so long as their ideas made sense and were contributing to society as individuals. Then, eventually, the alt-left label began being used on the internet for people like myself who still felt more comfortable voting left-wing for the most part, have an economic futurist perspective that believe in trying to find a way of helping out the needy, but also fucking hates the identity politics of the left. As I have said numerous times, but a lot of idiots seem to never hear, I did not actually coin the phrase alt-left, but I did come up with it myself when I started using it, as I had never heard it before. There is some guy named Robert Lindsay who is insistent on claiming that he coined the term alt-left. He's kind of the Richard Spencer of the alt-left in that way. And apparently, from what I've heard, he is a little bit of a race realist, but I haven't really investigated all that much into him, and from what I hear, not a whole lot of people take him all that seriously as a political theorist in general. Still, because the establishment wants the masses to be polarized and in neatly categorized right and left boxes, establishment media was very threatened by any growing and unified pool of left-leaning people who actively reject the identity politics-obsessed Democratic Party. Therefore, left-leaning publications like Vanity Fair started making hit pieces about the label alt-left, and Fox started with the framing that I talked about earlier, in the way that they started calling Antifa the alt-left. So here's the kicker. Both labels went from being alternatives of the norm to being heightened versions of the norm. What I mean is that, in reference to the alt-right, people have been saying that all Republicans are racists for decades, and the alt-right was actually doing a decent job for a moment of proving that these new Republicans mostly cared about free speech and libertarian ideals. But Hillary Clinton's campaign and subsequent smears came around and ruined all of that with framing tactics. And now, the alt-right is considered the most racist of the racist right-wing people. And the alt-left, instead of being people who are left-leaning idealists economically but still hate identity politics, the alt-left has been framed by places like Fox News into meaning the hyper-identity politics-obsessed Antifa crowd who thinks that America is a white supremacist nation that should be overthrown, etc. So basically, the alt-right, instead of being an alternative right, which the name obviously fucking implies, became the far-right racists that the left always thought the right was anyway, and the alt-left became the far leftist lunatics. So really, there's nothing alternative about either thing that are now known as alt. And this was all just based around people repeatedly using the terms without much care around accurately representing what people who actually identified with the terms were really saying, aside from Richard Spencer. Sadly, for the alt-right, all that seems to be left is legitimate Richard Spencer followers and white nationalist types. Sadly for the alt-left, the label seems confined to groups on Facebook like the alt-leftist empire, who from the comments from my video yesterday alone have represented themselves to largely be a similar mentality to a D-list free speech fraternity who claims not to invite Antifa to their parties, but admits that they come sometimes anyway. Because free speech, bro! Seriously, a lot of them acted basically exactly like them. It was sort of silly, but some of them seem nice. I will admit, some of you guys seem nice. It would be less than 25% of you. But hey, it's a funny thing to think about generally, the way that mainstream media was successfully able to change the slang abbreviation word alt from meaning alternative into meaning extremism. I'll repeat. Mainstream media changed the definition of the word alt from meaning alternative into meaning extremism. I suppose people are just gullible that way. That's all I have to say for this video. Drop me a comment. Help me out on Patreon, please. And stay tuned. Thanks.